I've been rediscovering old projects that I created using Cinema 4D R18 and R19. It's interesting to see how my skills have developed since then. I still got a lot to learn. In fact, I don't think the learning will ever stop, which is great because I love learning this stuff. There was one project that I really didn't expand on when I created it. I learned the technique and put it on the back burner. It was based on a technique I learned from one of Maxon's NAB shows. The presenter Zachary Corzine showed us some excellent techniques for blending objects and materials using a cloner object. Zachary was using Cinema 4D R19 and the presentation was fairly fast paced, just touching on the details of the technique. Today, Effectors have changed a lot since R19 and I thought it would be a good idea to expand the knowledge on what I learned back in 2018. Today I want to show you this technique, but I want to dive deeper and explain the blend option in the cloner, the difference between the Effectors post R19, how we can blend objects, what is required of the geometry we use, how we can blend deformers, and finally how to blend colours in Redshift and Octane using the cloner and Effectors. In this example that is playing right now is a really easy setup. Once you understand what can be blended in the cloner object, you can really apply this technique to create some really awesome motion graphics. I use plugins to create a keyframe free animation, but in this tutorial I will build a similar setup only using the tools in Cinema 4D. I'm only going to show you the basics of setting this up, so I'm going to leave the lighting and materials up to you. But if you want to see a breakdown of how I lit and textured my scene, leave a comment below and I will make a short breakdown and show you my setup and how I composited this in After Effects. So thanks to Zachary Corzine for sharing this technique, and I think you all agree that it's still relevant today. I really appreciate the time and effort that the motion designers like Zachary take to share their knowledge and help us grow. Hopefully what I'm going to show you today will complement what he showed us back in 2018. Hi, it's Beefy and welcome to my channel. If you haven't been here before, then this is where I post tutorials and breakdowns of my projects. If you're into design, 3D modeling, motion graphics, Cinema 4D, X particles and the like, then you're on the right place. So why not start by subscribing today? It will really help the algorithm find this channel and help me make more content. And if you're feeling really adventurous, then tinkle that bell so you don't miss a thing. Okay, so I've opened up a project in Cinema 4D and I'm using Cinema 4D S24. You can use any version of Cinema 4D to follow along, but there are slight differences between certain versions of Cinema 4D. And if you're using R19 and prior, your dialog in the falloff tab in your Effectors is going to be different to the one in R20 and beyond. So you'll still be able to follow along, it's just that you have to do things slightly different and I shall be pointing these out along the way. Okay, so with that being said, I'm just going to show you how the cloner works with the blend option before we start making our animation here. And I'm going to bring in a cube. So in this example, I'm going to blend between a cube and a sphere. I'm going to make this cube smaller, so I'm going to make sure that all my parameters are selected here. I'm just going to change the X here, hold Control and Enter, and this is going to change all the parameters there. And I'm just going to drop in a sphere, and I'm going to make the sphere 30 on the radius, so they're around about the same size. And I'm just going to bring in the cloner object, and I'm going to drop these into the cloner here. So at the moment this cloner is on grid array, so I want to change this to linear, and I'm going to say 10 on the account, and I want this to be on the X, so I'm going to zero out the Y, and I'm going to put 70 into the X there. So now we have this array of clones here, and at the moment our cloner is in iterate, so we got our cube, sphere, you get the point. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I want to change this iterate to blend, and this hasn't worked because I wanted this cube to blend into a sphere, and the cloner doesn't recognize the two different types of geometry. The cloner requires that both objects have the same base geometry, so this cube and this sphere have completely different types of geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the sphere, I'm going to duplicate the cube, so I'll hold Control and drag, and I'm going to name this one sphere. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the original cube and I'm going to turn off the cloner. And if I come into here, we can see what we're doing, and I want to make this cube a sphere. And the way I'm going to do that is to use the fillet, and I'm going to change the radius to 25, and I'm going to bring up the fillet subdivisions to 20. We now have our sphere. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch on our cube again, and I'm just going to come out here, and I'm going to turn on the cloner again, and this still hasn't worked. So I just said that the cloner needs to have the two objects to have the same base geometry, and we just made this sphere out of a cube, and you think it will work. If we look in the attributes for this sphere, the fillet is selected, and if we look at the cube, the fillet isn't selected. So the cloner still isn't recognizing that these are two objects that have the same base geometry. So what we need to do is we need to switch on the fillet, and now it's worked. So as long as you have the fillet selected in both objects, this is going to work. And you can just actually, if you don't want any fillet on the cube, you could just turn that off. So now we have this straight cube here, and this is still working. So now that the cloner recognizes that these are the same base geometry, it's just going to use the object properties to blend between the two different shapes. And also it's going to look at the fillet radius, and it's going to blend between 0 centimeters to 25, and also the subdivisions. So you can have no subdivisions in here. If I just come into the front view here, you can see the actual evolution between the cube with no fillet as it's morphing into the sphere, that these subdivisions here are actually increasing along with the fillet radius. So this is how the cloner works with the blend option. Okay, so come back to perspective view. So what I'm going to show you now is something different. You can actually blend between two different deformers as well. So I'm just going to get rid of the sphere here, and let's just turn the fillet off here, and I'm going to turn the clone off, and I'm going to make some adjustments to this cube. So I'm going to say I want to change the Y to 150. So we have this tall cube here, and I'm going to apply a couple of deformers to this. So I'm just going to make sure my cube is selected, come to the deformer drop down, and I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to select taper, and I'm going to do the same again, and I'm going to select a twist. Okay, so I'm going to make some changes here on the twist. I'm going to increase the angle, and this isn't working because I haven't got enough geometry on my cube. So I'm just going to come into my cube here, and I'm just going to put 20 on all of my parameters here. Select all of these and do Control Enter, and I can change all the parameters at the same time there. And now I'm going to come to the twist. I'm just going to increase the angle again, and now we have our twist working. And I'm just going to come to the taper, and I'm going to increase the strength here, and just put a bit of curvature on, and we've got this nice looking ice cream, which is pretty cool. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm just going to duplicate this cube, and I'm going to call one ice cream, and the other one base cube. Now the way that the cloner works with the blend option is that both objects have to have the same base geometry, and you also have to have both objects have the same deformers on. So I could just take this base cube here, and I'm just going to I'm going to turn off the ice cream so we can see what we're doing. So I'm just going to change the parameters in the twist, and I'm going to put that back to default, and the same with the taper here. So now we're back to our original cube here, and I'm just going to come to the object properties of the cube, and I'm just going to decrease the Y. I'm going to say 10. We don't need all these segments now, so I'm just going to put these back to 1. And now we have our new cube here. This is our base cube, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch on the ice cream and come into the cloner. I'm going to increase the size of the X here, say 100. I'm going to just turn that on, and now we have our blend between our base cube and our ice cream there. So I'm just going to switch off the deformers here. Okay, so that's how the cloner and the blend works with deformers. So you have to make sure that you have the same deformers on each object, and each object has to have the same base geometry. I'm repeating myself, but I like to get the point across. And if I come to the front view here, we can see the evolution here. So now that our segments are increasing, so in the base cube we have 1 segment, and in the ice cream we have 20 segments, and we can actually add a fillet as well if we want to, but you have to make sure that the fillet is switched on both objects. So that's the evolution between our base cube and into our ice cream. So in a nutshell, that's how the cloner works with the blend option there. Okay, so you can also blend between colors in Octane and Redshift, so I'm going to show you that later. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to crack on and I'm going to create our animation. So I'm just going to delete everything here, come back to default, and I'm going to bring in the cube. So I'm going to change the size of the cube here. I'm going to say 50 by 50 by 50. And I'm going to make the Y 150. So I'm going to add a couple of deformers here. So I'm just going to come to the deformer tab here, and I'm going to apply a bend. Hold down shift, and that's applied to the cube. And I'm going to apply a taper. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that I bend after I've applied the taper there, because I want to taper before I bend. And I'm just going to increase the strength here to maybe about 70. Okay, and I'm going to add some curvature here. I need to add some more geometry to my cube, so I'm just going to come into the Y segments here. I'm going to put 20. And now I'm going to bend this object, and I'm going to bend it to around about 30. So that's looking good there. I'm going to apply a fillet, and I think 3 is good. I'm just going to increase the subdivisions to about 10, so our faces there on our cube are going to be straight there. And that's looking good. Actually, I'm going to increase the taper a little bit. I'm going to increase this to about something like that. That's looking good there. So this is our pointy thing. This is the thing that's going to point towards the sphere. And I'm just going to name this pointy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, hold control and drag. And I'm going to call this one base cube. I'm going to turn off the pointy for the moment. I'm going to come into the base cube, and I'm just going to set everything back to default in the deformers here. And I'm going to make this height on the Y. I'm going to make this, I don't know, 10. Okay. So that's looking good there, and I'm just going to put the segments back to 1, and I'm just going to decrease the fillet to maybe about 1, so we have this kind of straight looking cube there. And I'm going to turn off my deformers from the live viewer here, hold Alt, and I'm going to double click all of these just to hide them. They're still going to be working in the background, but we can just hide them. And I'm going to turn back on the pointy, and I'm going to bring in a cloner. I'm going to call this cloner base cloner. And I'm just going to drop these into my cloner there, and we got our grid array again. And I'm just going to change this to linear. I'm going to put 10 on the count. And I'm going to make this on the X, so I'm just going to change this around to say 80 there. And now we have our array of cube and pointy things, and I'm just going to make this blend. And now we got this evolution from the cube into the pointy thing there. Okay, so I want these to be sitting on the XZ plane, and if I come into the one of these here, the base cube, I know my base cube is 10 centimeters tall, and I just want to raise this up by 5 centimeters. And if I try doing that, it's not going to work, because outside of the clone in the other world, that this is now moved up 5 centimeters. In the clone world, it's not working. So what we need to do is we need to trick the cloner into doing this. So I'm going to put these into a null. So I'm going to hold Alt and G, and this is the base cube, and I'm going to do the same for the pointy, Alt G, and this is pointy. So the clone is now recognizing that these are still the same objects as before. I can now come into our objects here, and I can now just adjust the height and the Y. So the base I'm going to raise up by 5 centimeters, and the pointy I'm going to do 75 because it's 150 centimeters tall. And now we have everything sitting on the XZ plane, which is exactly what we want. And you can see the evolution there of this growing into the pointy thing. So I'm going to come back to the perspective view here. And what I'm going to do now is I want to be able to control the growth of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a plane effector. So I'm just going to make sure my clone is selected there. And I'm going to come to the MoGraph tab here, and I'm going to add a plane effector. So everything's now just jumped 100 centimeters into the air. So we just come to the parameter of the plane object there, and I'm just going to zero this out. And in fact, I'm going to switch off all the parameters here in the transform. We're not going to be using that. And what we're going to be using is modify clone. So if I increase this modify clone here, you can see that we're now morphing between one and the other, which is cool. You can animate that, but it's going to be a bit of a lame animation doing it that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to control this in the fall off. So if I come to the fall off here, I'm going to add a linear field. And now we have some action here. So now we have some control. If I can grab this. Now we have some control over the growth of our clones, which is really, really cool. So I'm just going to come to the plane here. I'm going to turn off the color because it's really annoying. We can see this better here. So that's the basis of our animation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to finesse this now. I'm going to get rid of the linear field. and I'm going to change the plane effector name to plane controller. Okay, and this is what we're going to use to control the clones, like I said, and I'm going to come to the base cloner here, and I only want one in the count now because I'm just going to be morphing one clone here. And now I want to put this into a grid array, so I'm just going to select another cloner, hold down Alt and bring that in. So now we now have our pointy things in the grid array. So I'm just going to make some changes here. So I'm going to change the name of this cloner to grid cloner. So we know which one's what. I'm just going to come to the count of the grid cloner here, and we're already in per step. So I'm just going to change the space between the clones here. Say 60 and 60. We can actually change this later if we want to. So everything's procedural, which is the good thing about this. Now the thing about this setup is that we're in the instance mode, and we usually have the options of using render instance and multiple instance, and this isn't going to work for this animation. So on both cloners we have to make sure that we're set on instance, otherwise this isn't going to work. So on the base cloner, when we use the plane controller, it's not going to be a smooth transition between the two objects. So I'm just going to make sure that these are both on instance. Okay, so it's a little bit of a pain, but I'm just pointing this out because, like, when you're making the initial setup, you have to make sure that you have enough clones that aren't going to bomb your machine. So if you put this up too high, you can crash Cinema 4D, or you can just slow your viewport down. So I'm just going to change this to something like 15 and 15. But my message is that, so just working parameters that aren't going to slow you down, and also it's going to avoid you having a crash. And saying that, I just need to save my project. Okay, so now we have that saved. So what I want to do now is I want to control these clones, and the way I'm going to control that is with an object. So I'm just going to bring in the sphere, and if I just come to the front view here, we have our sphere. That's way too big, so I'm just going to make this, I don't know, like 30. Yeah, that's looking good. And I'm just going to bring this sphere up to sit just above our pointy things. And I'm going to come back to our perspective view here. So let's rename our sphere to target sphere. And I'm just going to bring this down underneath the plane controller. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create a null, and I'm going to call this Effectors. And I'm just creating that because I don't want to clutter up my object tab here. So I'm just going to drop my Effectors into this null, so I can just close that and we can just hide that there. And what I'm going to do now is actually I'm going to select my controller here. So I want to use this target sphere the same way that we used our linear field earlier. And so I'm going to come to the plane controller here, and this is where it differs with R19 and prior. And in R19 and prior, you have a different dialog here. So if you're using the sphere as a fall off, you need to, in R19 and prior, you need to select what type of fall off you're going to be using. And if you select source, then you can reference your sphere as the fall off. But with R20 and beyond, I'm just going to take this sphere and I'm just going to drop this straight into the field here. Now everything's gone back to the base cube there. And I just need to make some changes to my target sphere here. So I want to keep the mode in as points, and I just want to increase the radius of our fall off here. But first I'm going to come to remapping, and I'm going to say my inner offset is 50. and I want to make this curved on the contour. And if I come back to the layer here, if I just push this up to 100 centimeters, nothing's happening. You can actually go beyond 100 centimeters, so I'm just going to put in 400. So now we have some action here. So if I just take my target sphere and I just move this around, you can see that the clones are reacting to the target sphere there, which is pretty cool. So I'm just going to put this back to the center here. So now what I want to do is I want to make these pointy things look at the sphere here, and the way we're going to do that is to apply another effector. So I'm going to select the base cloner here. So at the moment the base cloner has the plane controller there as an effector. So I'm just going to make sure this is selected, and I'm just going to come to the MoGraph tab and I'm going to apply a target. And now we have all our clones pointing to the center here. So these are actually just looking at the effector at the moment. So I'm just going to drop this into the effectors null there. So just keep this all tidy. And if I come to the target effector tab, it's looking for an object target. And at the moment we have nothing in here. So I just need to take this target sphere here and drop that into the field. And now we get this reaction here. And that's looking pretty interesting, but we don't want that for this animation. So at the moment I have used pitch checked, so I'm going to uncheck that, and now everything's back to normal. So now if I just take my target sphere here and move this around, everything's reacting to our target, which is cool. But this still isn't looking right there. So there's a couple of things. Our pointy things aren't actually looking at the target. Every clone here is actually reacting to the target as well. So I want to put some fall off on the target. So I'm going to do that first. And first I'm going to increase the size of our grid. So I'm going to say 30 by 30. I know my machine can handle this. And as you can see, this is spreading out to the edge here, that all the clones are reacting to the target. So I'm going to add some fall off first. So I'm going to come to the target effector and I'm going to come to the fall off, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drop my target sphere into the field here, and if I do the same thing here, I'm going to put like an inner offset of 50%. And put a curve and I fall off there, and I've come to the layer and I'm just going to increase this to 400. So now we're back to the way we had it, and now only the clones within the fall off are reacting to the target. And the other issue of the pointy things, let's just come in here, the pointy things aren't looking at the sphere here, so I just need to come to my base cloner here. And if I come to the pointy object, if I come to the bend, then I can just change the angle of the bend. So I think it's like 90 degrees here. And now everything is looking at the target there, which is pretty cool. So as I move this around, that's looking pretty cool. Okay, so I'll put that back in the center there. So that's basically our animation there. So all we need to do now is just animate the sphere. So in my original animation, my grid was circular. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make that, I'm going to increase my grid again. I'm going to increase this up to 40 by 40. And I'm going to use another plane effector to make this circular here. So I'm going to select the grid cloner this time, and I'm going to apply another plane effector, and I'm going to name this plane effector plane grid mask. Okay, so I'm just going to drop that into the effector null here, and And what I want to do to this plain grid mask, I want to apply a fall off. So if I come to the parameters here, so everything's jumped up 100 centimeters again. So I'm just going to switch that off. And I'm going to turn everything off in the transform. And what I'm going to be using is visibility. So I'm just going to make sure this visibility is checked, and I'm going to come to the fall off. So nothing's happened now. So we just need to add a fall off to make this work. And I'm just going to select spherical fields, and that's great there. And I'm going to come to the field here, and I'm going to increase this so we get more of the grids showing here. So I'm going to increase this up to 2500. So that's looking pretty cool here. I'll just see whether, yeah, so that's about the right size I'm going to use here. So I'm going to just turn off this color, it's really annoying. Okay, so now when we move our target sphere around, this is reacting like so, which is really cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to set up a track for our sphere to move around, and I'm just going to do a quick spline here. So I'm just going to come to the top view, and I'm just going to come out here. So this is the area that we're working in. I'm going to turn off my fields here. I'm just going to hold Alt and I just hide these. I don't need to see them. Okay, so now this is the area that I'm working on. So I'm just going to select the spline pen, and I'm just going to draw a spline, just a quick rough one. You can take a bit more time in making your one. So this is my spline. So I'm just going to change my spline from Bezier to B-spline, just to make it a little bit more smoother there. And I'm just going to change this to uniform. I'm going to put 20 intermediate points on here. I think that should be enough there. And let's come back let's come to our front view here. And I'm going to take this spline, let's come to the model mode there, and I'm just going to bring this spline up so it's level with our sphere. And I'm going to come to the perspective view here. And I'm going to bring the spline down near the target sphere, just arrange this so that we can see what we're doing here. And I'm going to add a align to spline to the target sphere here. And then in align to spline, I'm just going to bring this spline in here. And so now that we can keyframe the position. So I'm going to add a few more keyframes to my timeline here. I'm going to say like 360. And I'm on 0 at the moment, so I'm going to just put a keyframe for a position. And I'm going to come down to the end, and I'm going to say 100%. And add a keyframe. I want this to be at a constant rate, so I'm just going to right click, come to animation and show F curve. And these are already selected here, these keyframes, so I'm just going to make these linear. Okay, so now when we play this, it's going to be running a little bit slow because I've got a lot of clones, and as I said, I can't sort of change the instant mode, so we just have to live with this. But that's looking pretty cool already. And the other thing I did in my original animation is I added a tail to this target here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off my clones there at the moment, and I'm just going to concentrate on this target here. So this is like animation around, which is pretty cool. So that's great there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add some keyframes to this spline because I want this to turn around. So I can say, come to the coordinates here. So I just want to rotate on the H here. You can actually use a vibrate tag, but you can get some like really erratic looking animations using that way. And I'm just going to say this is going to be 0, and I'm going to come up to say, I don't know, 160 and make this 200, and just come down here to 360, and I'm going to put this back to 0. I'm not going to worry about making these linear. It's going to add some variation to this, which is pretty cool. So as this is spinning around, we also got some extra motion on our spline there, so we can get something a little bit more organic. So it's up to you how you do this. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the tail to my target here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use I'm going to use another MoGraph object. I'm going to use a tracer. And if I come to the object tab in my tracer, I've already selected my target sphere, so that's now applied to my tracer there. So if I just press play, now we have our splines showing the root of our target, which is pretty cool. But I don't want all these splines. I'm just going to uncheck trace vertices. So now we're going to have 1, which is pretty cool. So I want to limit my spline, so I'm just going to say from the end, and I'm going to say 30 frames. So whatever the speed of the target going around, the spline is going to be limited to 30 frames, so it will shrink and grow as it moves around. So I'm just going to demonstrate this. So this tail is following behind our target there, which is exactly what we want. So we need to make sure this spline shows up in our render here. So I'm going to add some geometry to it. So I'm going to come up to this drop down menu. I'm going to bring in the sweep, and I'm also going to bring in the circle. So I'm going to make this circle smaller here. I'm going to say 5 centimeters. And I'm just going to drop these all into the sweep here. So I'm going to add the circle and then make sure that these are in the right order here. So now we have geometry on our tail, which is looking pretty cool. And I'm just going to make some changes here. I'm going to increase the size of our circle to say, I don't know, 15. And then I'm going to come to the sweep here, and if I come down to the details, let's just move this up here. I'm going to change the scale of our sweep here. I want to make this thin at the end and fat at the top here. So I'm just going to bring this point down here, and I'm going to give this a little bit of a curve in the shape here. And now we have our tail here. I'm just going to decrease the circle here. I'm going to say 12. Yeah, that's looking pretty cool there. So now as this goes around, this looks like a little tail that's following around. And I added some particles to this using X particles, and that's looking pretty good. So when you come to the end of the animation, you're going to notice that the tail jumps, and this is because that the tracer needs some motion before it can actually grow. And if you're going to be using this, you're going to have to render out a few more frames. So say that you render out, instead of 360, you render out 370. So when you bring your project into compositing, adjust the start so it's going to look seamless. But this is basically everything here. I'm just going to turn these cloners back on, and I'm just going to come in a little bit. So I'm going to make a preview here, and you got these parameters here. I'm going to make sure I'm doing 0 to 359. Just going to cancel this. I'm going to show you this quickly. So the clones, I'm not worried about the sweep at the moment, but the clones I want to loop. And at the moment I've got 361 frames on my timeline. If I come to frame 0 and I come to the 360th frame, you can see that these are exactly the same frame. So in my preview, I'm going to make sure that I'm rendering between 0 and 359, just so that the clones loop. And so if you're using a tracer in your animation, you're going to need to render a few more frames just so that loops. But the base of your animation is going to be 360 frames. So just make sure that you calculated that right. And so when you bring it into the compositing software, just make sure that you're rendering 360 frames. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this preview and we shall see what we got here. Okay, so our preview's just been made and I'm just going to make this bigger. This is low resolution, but I want to zoom in here so you can see. So we now have our animation there and this is looking pretty cool. So this is the basics for our animation, and now it's up to you on how you're going to art direct this. There are many things you can play around with in this technique, so just play around with the different types of deformers to create different types of clones. Play with the falloff and you can affect more clones by expanding the falloff. If you're using R20 and beyond, you can experiment by layering different fields and blending them to create different types of animations and looks. I showed you this in my last tutorial and the possibilities are endless. So what I'm going to show you now is how to blend materials in Redshift and Octane using the effectors. I have to say that I find Redshift a better render engine for rendering MoGraph in Cinema 4D these days. Recently I've been having a lot of problems with Octane and the clones don't behave the way I expected them, and I have been experiencing more crashes than usual. But saying that, I still love Octane. So I'm not going to waffle on any longer, so I'm just going to crack on and I'm going to show you the color blending in Redshift and Octane. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to blend between materials in Octane using the cloner and plane effector here. And I've got this small scene set up here, so I'm just going to show you this quickly. We've already know how to set this up, so I just got a cube and a sphere blending together. Okay, so at the moment I've got my fields color activated, and if we just come into the plane effector here, that's in our fold off, so our linear field has our fields color there. I'm just going to be using the Effector color, so I'm just going to come to the parameter here and I'm going to change the color mode to Effector color. So now we have this blank slate here. So now I'm going to add a mixed material and I'm just going to apply that straight onto my cloner object here. And I'm just going to open up the node editor here so we can see what's going on. So I'm just going to come in here, just like move this over like this. That's going to be just fine. So I want to mix two materials together. So I'm just going to use two diffuse materials, but I can use any material that you want. And I'm just going to change this one to a blue and this one to a green. Okay, that's great. So any old green, any old blue. We're not on a fashion parade here. So this is material 2 and this one's going to be material 1. Okay, so at the moment our colors are being controlled by a float texture here. So we got the percentage of green, percentage of blue, and we all know this. But what I want to do is I want to use something else to control the color. So I'm just going to come to the mixed materials here. On the amount, use the drop down menu. I'm going to come down to MoGraph color shader. And now this color shader is controlling our colors here for us. So if we come to our linear field, and I'll just move this down, nothing's happening. Okay, so that's a surprise. Okay, so what I want to do is I need to come to the cloner object here, and if I come to the transform tab, our color is actually white at the moment. So if you think of black is off and white is on, this cloner is actually still piping color into our clones here. So I just need to turn this off. So I'm just going to come down here and that's off. And so now when I use the linear field, these are now all changing color here. So this is only going to happen in the live viewer here because the Octane materials don't play well in the perspective view here, but in the live viewer here you can see that these are changing color. Okay, so that's how you blend between materials in Octane. Okay, so I've got this small scene set up and we know how to make this already. So it's just a sphere and a cube just blending together. At the moment I have my fields color on, so these are blue, and this is actually showing in our Redshift render view here, unlike the Octane. And what I want to do is I want to show you how to blend between two materials so that when we move our effector, we're going to blend between two materials here. So at the moment, in my plane effector, if I come to the fall off, you can see that we have our color activated, and I just want to come to the parameter and I want to change fields color to effector color. So when we come to the fall off now, that has now been deactivated. So now we've got this blank slate here, which is what we want. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a material, a Redshift material, and I'm just going to open this up here. I just want to come in here a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And I'm just going to bring this one down here and this one up here. Okay, so I'm just going to apply this material straight to our clone here. And this is being applied here. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to have two materials piped into the output here, and I want to blend between the two. So I'm just going to, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come to the materials and I'm going to bring it in a material blender, and I'm just going to pipe this into the surface. Okay, and I'm going to just move this one down here, just come out a little bit so we can see everything there. Okay, so this material here, I'm just going to come to the base properties and I'm going to just change this to a blue, to any old blue. I'm just using colors to demonstrate here, but you can use any material that you want. And this is there, so I'm just going to pipe this into our material blender, and this is going to be our base color. This is now changing the render view there. And so I'm going to bring another material in, and this material I'm going to pipe into layer color 1, and I'm just going to change the color here to a green. Any old green, we're not on the fashion parade. So what I want to do is I want to be able to blend between the two here. The way I'm going to do that is to bring in another node here, and I can never find this in the list, so I'm just going to search for it. This is the color user data. I'm just going to pop this here. So this is my color user data here. So I just want to pipe that into my material blender, and I'm going to come to layer 1, and this is going to be my blend color 1. Okay, so let's just scroll down here. Let's grab the linear field and let's just move this around, and we're morphing between our cube and sphere, but our colors remain blue, so we need to do something else here. So I want to come to the color user data, but I need to add an attribute name. So I need to come down to objects and add object color. And now this has taken effect, so everything's turned green. So we take our linear field here. It's still remaining green. So despite of blending between the cube and the sphere, this is remaining as green. And the reason why that is that we need to come to the cloner, and at the moment if we come to the transform here, our color in transform is white, and you have to think of as black is off and white is on. So at the moment this color is still being piped into our clones, so we just need to turn that off. so I'm just going to make that black. Okay, so now if we come to our linear field and we just move that down, we are now blending between two materials, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so like Octane, the materials don't play well in the perspective view here. Your effects are all going to be in the Redshift render view. So that is how you blend between two materials in Redshift. I really hope what I've shown you today has helped you in any way and you've learned something useful from this. I would love to see what you've made using this technique, so tag me in Instagram at almostdailyrender, and don't forget to like, subscribe and jingle the bell so you don't miss a thing. And as always, any questions, comments, then please leave them below. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next video.